Throughout Chinese history, almost every dynasty that fell apart went through the same thing: peasant uprisings. Not every uprising directly ended a dynasty, but without exception, they all accelerated its collapse, and so people naturally arrived at the same conclusion. It was the peasants who brought the dynasties down. But if you look at it from a different angle, was it the uprising that caused the dynasty to fall, or was it the dynasty's own decline that made the uprising inevitable? These two ways of seeing it point to completely different answers. When a dynasty started to rot, the first people to notice weren't the peasants. It was the landlords, watching land consolidate into fewer and fewer hands. The frontier armies, watching their rations arrive later and later. The officials, deep in factional games that served no one but themselves. But most of these people didn't rebel. Why? Because they were tied to the dynasty by invisible threads of interest. For many who depended on the system, a rotting dynasty didn't necessarily mean immediate loss. A decaying order could still be profitable for those positioned to take advantage of it. The peasants were different. They carried the obligations, taxes, labor, obedience, and received less and less of the protection the system owed them in return. When even surviving became impossible, they were the ones with nowhere left to go. So the peasants weren't the first to see the problem. They weren't the first with the power to resist. They were simply the last to be pushed to the edge. When the Yellow Turban uprising broke out, the Han Dynasty had already been rotting for years. When the peasants raised their flags, they weren't announcing the beginning of a revolution. They were announcing the formal arrival of a death that had been coming for a long time. But here's a deeper question worth sitting with. The problems were so visible. Couldn't the people at the top see them? Most of the time, they could. Chinese history never lacked clever emperors or ministers who genuinely worried about their country. Memorials arrived at the palace one after another, all describing the same things. Frontier armies going unpaid year after year, land deeds flowing steadily into the hands of the powerful, local corruption becoming harder and harder to hide. They knew these were problems, and yet they couldn't fix them. Why? There are two layers to the answer, and both have to be present for the full picture. The first layer is human nature, the tendency to delay. Reform has a window. The easiest time to reform a dynasty is precisely when it looks like reform isn't needed. In prosperous times, the emperor has resources, authority, room to maneuver. Resistance would be at its weakest, but a prosperous emperor doesn't reform. Things are fine, he thinks. Why change anything? By the time the problems can no longer be ignored, and the emperor finally wants to act, the window is nearly shut. Think of it like a dam. When the first crack appears, the cost of repair is small. But no one wants to fix a crack when the water is calm. By the time the crack has grown and everyone rushes to patch it, it's already too late. The second layer is structural, the logging in of vested interests. Human delay alone doesn't explain everything. Often, it wasn't that the emperor didn't want to reform. It was that the greatest resistance to reform came from inside the court itself. Take land consolidation. The emperor knew it was a problem. But who were the larger landowners? The gentry class. And who was the gentry class? The officials. The very foundation the dynasty ran on to reform the land was to reform the dynasty's own power base. The greatest enemy of reform wasn't the problem itself, it was the people who were benefiting from the problem. And those people were the court. Wang Anshi's reforms are the clearest example. Emperor Shenzong gave his full support. Wang Anshi pushed with everything he had. But whatever the merits of the plan, what truly determines whether a reform succeeds is rarely the design, it's the execution. When the new policies reached the provinces, they came back unrecognizable, not because the officials were stupid, but because they knew exactly how to make a reform look like it was happening, while changing nothing at all. Human delay plus structural lock-in, layered together, they made genuine reform nearly impossible. At this point, many people might think, surely, if the dynasty had just found a smarter, more hard-working emperor, couldn't it have been saved? This is where history becomes truly harsh. Many dynasties at their end didn't lack effort. What they lacked was the moment when change was still possible. When the dam has already broken, even the best engineer cannot hold back the flood. Emperor Chongzhen of the late Ming was famously hardworking. He pored over memorials almost every night. He rotated ministers constantly, deploying troops today, scrambling for funds tomorrow. Every day brought a new crisis. Every day brought another one behind it. He knew where the problems were. He kept trying to fix them, but not one of those efforts could turn the clock back 20 years. The dam had already broken. He was desperately patching the flood. What he never realized was that the dam had been cracking for decades before the water came through. When Li Zicheng's army entered Beijing, Chongzhen climbed Coal Hill and tied a rope. It wasn't that he didn't try. He simply never acted at the right time. History does offer one rare exception. The Yongzheng Emperor. He pushed through land tax reform, cracked down on local corruption, and forced the gentry to pay taxes and perform service alongside ordinary people. The entire scholar official class hated him for it. But he succeeded. Yongzheng's success wasn't only about his strength of will. More importantly, he caught the window before it closed. The Yongzheng Emperor had left a relatively stable financial foundation. Population pressure hadn't yet reached a breaking point. The Manchu ruling group still held firm control. The dam had cracks, but it hadn't broken yet. He chose to repair the cracks while repair was still possible, and he was forceful enough that those who wanted to stop him couldn't. But he didn't change the underlying pattern of history. He only reinforced the dam one more time, pushing the flood back by more than 100 years. This wasn't Yongzheng's failure. It's simply that no reform is ever permanent. A dam needs constant maintenance. The cracks one generation repairs can be allowed to spread again by the next. Reform cannot guarantee permanent success, but it can prevent the failures that didn't have to happen. The Qing dynasty eventually walked the same road. Almost every dynasty in Chinese history followed the same path. A crack appeared in the dam. No one repaired it. Problems accumulated quietly through the prosperous years. Those in power chose to wait. when the steel had the chance to act. By the time the crack became a bridge, and the flood finally came rushing in, the peasant uprising was simply the moment the water arrived. This isn't only a story about dynasties. It happens in almost every person's life. We always find, when the crack is still small, that the cost of fixing it seems too high. So, we wait. By the time the crack grows too large to ignore, we find that the cost has become the entire dam. What truly destroys a dam is never the final flood. It's the first time someone noticed the crack and decided a little longer won't hurt.